Welcome to the IT Interview Challenger channel. We provide a collection of questions and answers primarily focused on IT knowledge to help you prepare for upcoming interviews, practice for exams, or just boost your professional skills. We hope you'll find real value from tuning in.
How would you ensure that scientists can only access their own documents in an Amazon S3 bucket, while also tracking their access for compliance?
I would create an identity policy that grants read and write access, but adds a condition that the S3 paths must be prefixed with the scientist's username. Additionally, I would configure a trail with AWS Cloud Trail to capture all object-level events in the S3 bucket and store the output in another S3 bucket. This way, we can use Amazon Athena to query the logs and generate the necessary reports.
How would you manage access to Docker images in Amazon Elastic Container Registry while minimizing operational overhead?
I would create a private repository in Amazon ECR and set up a permissions policy that allows only the required operations. I would include a condition to restrict access to accounts within the organization's AWS ID. Additionally, I would add a lifecycle rule to delete untagged images, keeping only the 5 most recent ones.
How would you recommend a solution for taking snapshots of Amazon RDS DB instances every 6 hours and retaining them for 30 days?
I would recommend turning on the cross-account management feature in AWS Backup. Then, create a backup plan that specifies the frequency and retention requirements. Add a tag to the DB instances and apply the backup plan using those tags. Finally, use AWS Backup to monitor the status of the backups.
What steps would you take to allow an IAM user in Account A to assume a role in Account B within a multi-account architecture using AWS organizations?
I would configure the service control policy for Account A to allow the action, set the identity-based policy on the user in Account A to permit the action, and update the trust policy on the target role in Account B to allow the assumption.
How would you back up an on-premises file storage solution to Amazon S3 while supporting NFS and archiving files after 5 days?
I would deploy an AWS Storage Gateway file gateway associated with an S3 bucket. I would move the files to the file gateway and then create an S3 lifecycle rule to move the files to S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 5 days.
What solution would you recommend to minimize costs for a company using both Amazon EC2 instances and AWS Lambda functions?
I would recommend purchasing a compute savings plan to cover the entire expected cost of the EC2 instances, Lambda functions, and MemoryDB cache nodes.
How would you design a solution for a new online game on Amazon EC2 instances to ensure global availability and low latency?
I would create an auto-scaling group for the EC2 instances and attach it to a network load balancer in each region. Then, I would set up Amazon Route 53 with latency-based routing for each region's NLB. For game metadata, I would use an Amazon DynamoDB global table.
What steps would you recommend for deploying a third-party firewall appliance in a shared services VPC to ensure reliability and minimize failover time?
I would recommend deploying 2 firewall appliances in separate availability zones. Then create a gateway load balancer and attach a target group with the firewall instances. Finally, create a VPC gateway load balancer endpoint and add a route in the VPC's route table to designate this endpoint as the next hop for incoming traffic.
How would you migrate an on-premises legacy application with licensing and static IP requirements to AWS while ensuring high availability?
I would create a pool of elastic network interfaces and request license files from the vendor for that pool, storing them in Amazon S3. Additionally, I'd edit the Bootstrap automation script to read the database server IP address from the AWS Systems Manager parameter store and inject that into the local configuration files.
How would you minimize latency for users downloading reports from a sales reporting application when expanding operations to Europe?
I would configure a cross-region read replica for the RDS database in the new region and change the Route 53 record to geolocation routing to connect to the API gateway.
How would you create short-lived test environments for pull requests in a software company that need to communicate with a central server in an on-premises data center?
I would create a single VPC for the test environments, include a transit gateway attachment and the necessary routing configurations, and then use AWS CloudFormation to deploy all test environments into that VPC.
What changes would you make to ensure that an API on AWS can run across multiple regions in an active-active configuration?
I would deploy the API to multiple regions and set up Amazon Route 53 with custom domain names to route traffic to each regional API endpoint. Additionally, I would create a new KMS multi-region customer managed key and a replica key in each region. Finally, I would replicate the existing Secrets Manager secret to other regions and select the appropriate KMS key for each.
What solution would you recommend for migrating a stateful web application and MySQL database to AWS to ensure the highest reliability?
I would recommend migrating the database to Amazon Aurora MySQL, deploying the application in an auto-scaling group on Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, and storing sessions in an Amazon Elasticache for Redis replication group.
What solution would you recommend for providing secure remote desktop connectivity to Amazon EC2 Windows instances while integrating with on-premises Active Directory?
I would implement a VPN between the on-premises environment and the target VPC. This way, the target instances can be joined to the on-premises Active Directory domain over the VPN connection, allowing RDP access through the VPN.
What solution would you implement to ensure that all new Amazon EBS volumes are encrypted at rest?
I would turn on EBS encryption by default in all AWS regions.
How would you handle SSH key management for EC2 instances running simulations in the AWS Cloud?
I would launch new EC2 instances without any pre-configured SSH keys. Then, I would set up EC2 Instance Connect on each instance and create an IAM policy that allows engineers to use the Send SSH public key action. This way, they can connect using a browser-based SSH client from the EC2 console.
How would you enable DNS resolution for mobile banking applications running on Amazon EC2, instances that need to connect to an on-premises Active Directory?
I would create DNS endpoints using Amazon Route 53 Resolver and add conditional forwarding rules to resolve the DNS namespaces between the on-premises data center and the VPC.
How would you send continuous environmental data from sensors to a database without requiring fixed schemas?
I would use Amazon Kinesis Data Firehose to send the data to Amazon Redshift.
How would you migrate a legacy application using MongoDB to AWS while ensuring it meets specific connectivity and scalability requirements?
I would create new Amazon Document DB tables with MongoDB compatibility and provisioned IOPS volumes, then use the cluster endpoint to connect to Amazon Document DB.
What strategy would you recommend for migrating an on-premises MongoDB database to Amazon Document DB?
I would recommend creating an AWS Database Migration Service Replication instance. Then I would set up a source endpoint for the on-premises MongoDB database using change data capture. After that, I would create a target endpoint for the Amazon Document DB database and run a DMS migration task.
What solution would you recommend for a company wanting to join all Windows EC2 instances to an Active Directory domain on AWS while also implementing enhanced security like multi-factor authentication?
I would recommend creating an AWS Directory service for Microsoft Active Directory implementation. Then, I would launch an Amazon Workspace to connect and use it for domain security configuration tasks.
How would you approach migrating an on-premises application to AWS while decoupling product data from user session data and ensuring high performance?
I would create an Amazon RDS DB instance to host the product data and set up a read replica in another region for disaster recovery. Additionally, I would use an Amazon DynamoDB global table for the user session data.
How would you optimize costs in development accounts on AWS while ensuring that only burstable instances are used?
I would recommend creating a custom service control policy in AWS organizations to allow the deployment of only burstable instances and to disallow any irrelevant services. Then apply this policy to the development organizational unit.
How would you resolve the issue of deleting a CloudFormation stack that fails due to an existing S3 bucket?
I would modify the CloudFormation template to provision an Amazon Elastic file system to store the temporary files instead of using Amazon S3. Then, I would configure the Lambda functions to run in the same VPC as the file system and mount it to the EC2 instances and Lambda functions.
How would you design a cloud architecture for a mobile game backend that can handle varying load and provide low latency data access?
I would implement the REST API using AWS App Sync, run the business logic in AWS Lambda, and store player session data in Amazon Aurora Serverless.
What is the most operationally efficient way to replicate images from an on-premises NFS file system to an Amazon Elastic file system after migrating an application to AWS?
The most efficient way is to deploy an AWS Data Sync agent to an on-premises server with access to the NFS file system. You can then send the data over the Direct Connect connection to an S3 bucket using a public virtual interface. After that, configure an AWS Lambda function to process event notifications from Amazon S3 and copy the images to the EFS file system.
How can a company ensure that its web application is accessible only through the CloudFront endpoint after migrating to AWS?
The company can create a new security group for the CloudFront distribution and then update the ALB security group ingress to allow access only from this CloudFront security group.
What is the most cost-effective way to provide disaster recovery for a community forum site hosted on AWS?
The best solution is to store the Docker image in ECR in 2 regions. Schedule RDS snapshots every 8 hours, with copies to the secondary region. In case of failure, we would use AWS Cloud Formation to deploy the resources in the secondary region. Restore from the latest snapshot, and update the DNS record to point to the ALB in that region.
How would you design a multi-account environment in AWS for a company that needs to comply with various regulatory standards?
I would create an organization in AWS Organizations, enable AWS Control Tower, review the included controls for service control policies, check AWS config for necessary additions, and configure an IAM identity provider for federation with the on-premises Active Directory Federation services.
What steps would you recommend to optimize performance for an online magazine launching globally?
I would use an Aurora Global Database for physical cross-region replication and Amazon S3 with cross-region replication for static content. Additionally, I would implement Amazon Route 53 with latency-based routing and use Amazon CloudFront distributions while ensuring the web and application tiers are in auto-scaling groups.
How can an online gaming company optimize its AWS costs while ensuring the gaming application remains available?
The company can purchase an EC2 instance savings plan for the gaming application instances to ensure they are always available. For the analytics application, which can be interrupted, using spot instances would be the most cost-effective solution.
What steps would you take to ensure backups are resilient to breaches of privileged user credentials in an AWS environment?
I would implement cross-account backup with AWS Backup Vaults in designated non-production accounts, use AWS Backup Vault Lock in compliance mode, and configure the backup frequency, lifecycle, and retention period to ensure at least one backup always exists in the cold tier.
How would you design a solution to aggregate Amazon CloudWatch logs from multiple AWS accounts into a central logging account while ensuring scalability?
I would create a destination Amazon Simple Queue service queue in the central logging account. Then, I would create an IAM role that allows Amazon CloudWatch logs to send data to that SQS queue with a trust policy in place. Finally, I would set up an AWS Lambda function to normalize the logs in the member accounts and send them to the security tool.
What steps would you take to migrate a legacy application from an on-premises data center to AWS with the least amount of downtime?
I would use an AWS Server Migration Service replication job to migrate the database server VM to AWS and another replication job to migrate the application server VM to AWS.
How can a company control communication between its VPCs and AWS while connecting to an on-premises network?
To achieve that, I would set up transit gateway route tables and associate the VPCs and VPNs with those tables. Additionally, I would configure VPC peering between the VPCs and set up route tables on both the VPCs and VPNs.
How would you optimize the cost of an application on AWS that uses Lambda functions and ECS containers, especially considering inconsistent traffic loads?
I would migrate the database to an Aurora DB cluster with multiple writer instances and purchase instance savings plans.
What solution would you propose to improve the reliability of an application running on EC2 instances with a RED-heavy MySQL database?
I would migrate the application to AWS Step Functions state machines and set them as targets for the application load balancer. I would create an Amazon Elastic file system for the static content and configure the state machines to read from it. Additionally, I would migrate the database to Amazon Aurora MySQL Serverless v2 with a ReaderDB instance.
How can a solutions architect ensure that only authorized AWS users or roles can access an Amazon API gateway endpoint and analyze request latency?
The architect can set the authorization for the API gateway method to AWS Identity and Access Management. Then grant the IAM user or role the execute API.invoke permission on the REST API resource. It's also important to enable the API caller to sign requests with AWS signature. Finally, using AWS X-Ray will help trace and analyze user requests to the API gateway.
How can a company improve its CI/CD pipeline to reduce downtime caused by changes in CloudFormation templates?
The solution is to use AWS Code Deploy with a blue-green deployment pattern, replacing the user data deployment scripts. Operators would log into the running instances to verify that the application is functioning as expected.
What steps would you take after creating a VPC in the US East 1 region for a web application that needs to dynamically scale and maintain resiliency?
I would create a VPC in the US West 1 region and use inter-region VPC peering to connect both VPCs. Then, I would deploy an application load balancer spanning multiple availability zones in the US East 1 region and deploy EC2 instances across multiple availability zones in each region as part of an auto-scaling group served by the ALB.
How would you refactor a legacy application with .NET Framework components for AWS, ensuring complex orchestration and control over networking?
I would host the .NET Core components on AWS App Runner, use Amazon RDS for SQL Server for the database, and implement Amazon Event Bridge for asynchronous messaging.
What steps would you take to troubleshoot an insufficient capacity error when adding instances to a placement group in AWS?
I would create a new placement group and merge it with the original placement group.
How can a company avoid issues with unpatched instances in an auto-scaling group after a security update?
I would recommend modifying the auto-scaling group to set the update policy to target the oldest launch configuration for replacement. Additionally, creating automation scripts to patch an AMI, update the launch configuration, and invoke an auto-scaling instance refresh would be effective.
How would you provide access to the Python package index for a team using Amazon SageMaker instances in a VPC without internet access?
I would create a NAT instance in the VPC, configure the VPC routes for internet access, and set firewall rules on the SageMaker notebook instance to allow access only to the PyPI repository endpoint.
What solution would you recommend for a government agency that needs to save Amazon EBS snapshots in at least 2 additional AWS regions while keeping operational overhead low?
I would recommend configuring a policy in Amazon Data Lifecycle Manager to run daily and copy the EBS snapshots to the additional regions.
How would you ensure that developers can only launch T3 small EC2 instances in the US East 2 region?
I would create a service control policy that denies the launch of all EC2 instances, except for T3 small in US East 2, and attach it to the project's account.
How would you ensure timely replication of data from a radar station to an S3 bucket in a different account?
I would enable Amazon S3 transfer acceleration on the source bucket and configure the radar station with the most accurate data to use the new endpoint. Then I would monitor the total request latency metric of the destination bucket and set up an Amazon Event Bridge rule to alert if there are any changes.
What tools or services would you use to plan the migration of an on-premises data center to AWS?
I would use the AWS Cloud Adoption Readiness Tool, Amazon Inspector, and AWS Migration Hub.
How would you ensure that an application running on an Amazon EC2 instance operates across multiple availability zones?
I would replace the NAT gateway with a NAT instance, migrate the RDS for MySQL to an RDS for PostgreSQL instance, and launch a new EC2 instance in the other availability zones.
How would you migrate an on-premises transaction processing application running in Docker containers to AWS?
I would migrate the containers to Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service and use Amazon S3 for storing the shared transaction data.
How would you assess a company's current environment for migration to AWS when they lack an accurate inventory of their servers and applications?
I would use the AWS Migration Hub import tool to load the details of the on-premises environment and then generate a report using Migration Hub strategy recommendations.
How would you ensure regulatory compliance for API calls in a SaaS platform running on AWS with minimal operational overhead?
I would create a new AWS Cloud trail in the organization's management account, set up a new Amazon S3 bucket with versioning enabled to store the logs, and deploy the trail for all accounts in the organization. I would also ensure MFA delete and encryption are enabled on the S3 bucket.
What solution would you recommend for deploying a distributed in-memory database on Amazon EC2 instances to achieve the lowest possible networking latency?
I would recommend launching memory-optimized EC2 instances in a cluster placement group.
What solution would you recommend for automating daily backups of 10 terabytes of data from on-premises to AWS, considering the need for custom filters?
I would recommend using an AWS Snowball Edge device for the initial backup, and then using AWS DataSync for incremental backups to Amazon S3 daily.
How would you ensure that different user personas have least privilege access to an analytical solution on Amazon EMR?
I would create IAM roles for each user persona and attach identity-based policies that define their permitted actions. Additionally, I would set up an AWS config rule to check for non-compliant resources and notify the administrator for remediation.
How would you provide access to a new customer in the US East 1 region for a SaaS service hosted in EU West 2 without deploying new EC2 resources?
I would use AWS Resource Access Manager to share the EC2 instances in EU West 2. Then, in US East 1, I would create a network load balancer and an instance target group that includes the shared EC2 instances. Finally, I would configure a private link endpoint service that uses the NLB in US East 1 and grant specific AWS accounts access.
How would you monitor multiple Amazon S3 buckets across different regions and track the encryption percentage of objects?
I would deploy an AWS Lambda function in each region to list the number of buckets and the encryption status of objects. This data would be stored in Amazon S3, and I would use Amazon Athena queries to create a custom dashboard in Amazon QuickSight for the compliance teams.
How would you re-engineer CI/CD practices for quick patch deployments with minimal downtime?
I would configure code pipeline with a deploy stage using AWS Cloud Formation to create a pipeline for both test and production stacks. This way, we can monitor the newly deployed code, and if any issues arise, we can push another code update.
How can a company enforce tagging requirements for Amazon EC2 instances in AWS organizations?
The company should enable tag policies in the organization, create a tag policy for the business unit tag, ensure compliance with tag key capitalization is on, implement it for the EC2 instance resource type, and attach the policy to the organization's management account.
How would you migrate a workload of thousands of EC2 instances to use IPv6 while ensuring that private instances remain inaccessible from the public internet?
I would update the existing VPC to associate an Amazon-provided IPv6 CIDR block with the VPC and all subnets. Then, I would create an egress-only Internet gateway and update the route tables for all private subnets to add a route for Tier 0 to the egress-only Internet gateway.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our upcoming videos. See you next time.